You spend your whole life giving, your time, your energy, your love. You stay up late helping with school projects, work overtime just to afford that birthday gift they've been eyeing, miss meals so they don't have to, and put your own dreams on hold to make sure there's a chance. That's what being a parent is, right? Sacrifice, unconditional love, being there no matter what. I thought I had done it all right. I believed that one day my son would look back and see all that I gave and feel grateful. But I was wrong. One afternoon, I called him just to check in, nothing major. And what he said pierced through me like a blade I never saw coming. Dad, I'm just too busy for all these family obligations. Family obligations. That's what I had become to him, an obligation. Not a father, not a source of love or support. Just a checkbox he didn't want to tick anymore. I didn't respond with anger. I didn't cry, not right then. I just sat there in silence, holding the phone like it weighed 100 pounds. That was the moment I realized something devastating. Sometimes, the people we love most are the ones who hurt us without even knowing it. And sometimes, the more you give, the less they remember what it took to give it. So I made a decision, not out of spite, but out of love and maybe a little self-respect. I stepped back. I let him have the space he clearly wanted. And what happened next changed both our lives in a way neither of us saw coming. My name is Steven, and I never considered myself an extraordinary man. I wasn't the smartest in school or the most successful in my neighborhood. I didn't wear fancy suits or drive expensive cars. But I was proud of who I was, a hardworking father, a decent man who kept his promises, and someone who believed above all else in the importance of family. I was raised in a working-class household where emotions were buried beneath responsibilities and affection came in the form of actions, not words. My father wasn't the type to say, "I love you," but when he handed me his worn-out coat during the winter or stayed up to fix my broken bike, I knew he did. I took those quiet lessons and vowed that when I had a family of my own, I'd do even better. I wouldn't just show up. I'd be present in every way that mattered. When my son Caleb was born, everything shifted. The world felt bigger and more fragile all at once. Holding him in my arms for the first time, I made a silent promise that no matter what happened in life, I would never let him feel alone. From sleepless nights with fevers to early mornings coaching his little league games, I was there. I didn't care if it meant I had to take night shifts or say no to promotions that would steal more hours away from him. He was my priority. I knew the world could be cold, distant, and unpredictable. But I believed that if Caleb had a solid home, a steady hand to guide him, he'd have the foundation to face anything. I wanted to be his anchor, the one constant in a sea of change. We lived in a modest 2-bedroom house tucked at the edge of town. It wasn't much, but it was home. The porch creaked when you stepped on it, and the walls needed fresh paint every few years. But it carried the sounds of laughter, the scent of home-cooked meals, and the history of late-night talks over cups of tea. The backyard, though small, held years of memories, from his first steps in the grass to our Saturday afternoon barbecues where just the two of us would sit and talk about anything and everything. As Caleb grew older, I watched him develop into someone with dreams of his own. Curious, ambitious, a little impatient, but always kind. Or so I believed. Our bond wasn't perfect. We had our disagreements like any father and son. I'd remind him to pick up after himself, to be more grateful, to call his grandparents more often. He'd roll his eyes, call me old-fashioned, tell me I worried too much. But underneath all that, there was love. At least, that's what I clung to. I never doubted that he knew I was always in his corner, cheering him on quietly, even when he didn't notice. Every milestone of his life was a shared celebration for me. His high school graduation felt like a culmination of every lunch I packed and every hour I stayed up helping him study. When he got accepted into college, I cried. Not because he was leaving, but because I was proud. Because I believed I had done my job right. Even after he moved out, I made a point to stay connected. I call once or twice a week, not to pry, but just to ask how he was doing. If he sounded stressed, I'd offer to help in any way I could. When he forgot to pay a bill, I'd quietly take care of it. I'd drive across town just to fix a broken faucet in his apartment, even if it meant missing a day's work. I didn't see any of it as a burden. That's what love looks like, I thought. You show up, you do the small things, even when they go unnoticed. Especially when they go unnoticed. But over time, something began to shift. Caleb's tone became shorter. The calls became briefer. I told myself he was just busy, caught up in the hustle of young adulthood. Maybe it was work, or friends, or just life moving faster than he could keep up with. Still, I persisted. I showed up at his door with groceries. I reminded him of family events. I sent messages just to tell him I was proud of him. But there was a growing distance, an invisible wall that neither of us acknowledged, yet both of us felt. I started to feel like an afterthought in his life, like a bookmark he never returned to. And yet, I kept reaching out, convincing myself that love was patient, that one day he'd come around. I told myself that parents are supposed to give without expecting anything back. That maybe, just maybe, he was still the boy who once held my hand and begged me not to let go at the school gates. That maybe he'd just forgotten the sound of home, and all he needed was time to remember. Still, something inside me began to ache. There's a quiet kind of grief that comes with being ignored by someone you love, a subtle erosion of self-worth that no one warns you about. I didn't want to admit that the relationship I had built brick by brick was starting to crumble under the weight of neglect. And yet I held on until that phone call, the one where he said it so casually, so dismissively, that it shattered something inside me I didn't even know was breakable. That's the moment everything changed. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just sat with his words, letting them echo through all the memories we'd built together. And I realized something I had never allowed myself to consider before. Maybe my presence wasn't comforting to him anymore. Maybe I had become something he resented, an obligation, a relic of a past he was too busy to revisit. That thought hurt more than anything else, because I wasn't just losing a connection, I was losing the very thing I had poured my life into building. So I made a choice. I wouldn't chase him anymore. I wouldn't beg for time or affection. I loved my son with everything I had, but I couldn't keep knocking on a door that no one wanted to open. I deserved peace, too. And maybe, just maybe, stepping away would give him the space to see what he was pushing away. I packed my things and moved into a small apartment on the other side of town, quiet, simple, and painfully empty. The walls didn't echo with laughter, and the silence was thick. But it was mine. And for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to sit in that silence and ask, who am I when I'm not being someone's father? The days following my move into that small apartment were quiet, almost too quiet. I had always imagined that someday Caleb would drift a little further, find his independence, and maybe call a little less. I thought I had prepared for that. But nothing could have readied me for how quickly I went from being a central figure in his life to what felt like a forgotten memory. At first, I tried to convince myself it was normal. He was young, building his future, juggling responsibilities. But deep down, I knew something more had shifted. The bond that once connected us, the kind that survived scraped knees, first heartbreaks, and awkward teenage years, was unraveling thread by thread. And still, I said nothing. Not because I didn't care, but because I cared too much. I didn't want to guilt him or shame him into spending time with me. I wanted him to want it. That's the thing about unconditional love. It doesn't demand, but it still hopes. Weeks turned into months. No calls. No messages. Birthdays came and went. Family events passed without a word. My phone, once a lifeline to him, became a source of quiet dread. I used to light up when I saw his name flash on the screen. Now I just stared at the blank display, wondering if he ever thought to call, but just didn't. I remembered all the times I had dropped everything to be there for him. Rushing to his school when he forgot his presentation, fixing his car late at night, staying up just to talk when he was going through his first real breakup. Those moments, once so vivid, started to feel like relics of another lifetime. I started asking myself questions I never thought I'd entertain. Had I done something wrong? Had I been too overbearing? Too involved? Or was I just no longer necessary? Then came the day that still haunts me. It was a Sunday. I was feeling nostalgic and decided, against my better judgment, to give him a call. Just to hear his voice, to remind him I existed. The line rang, once, twice, then voicemail. I hung up, not wanting to leave a message that would likely go unheard. Hours later, he called back. I answered immediately, hopeful. His voice was tired, distant. I asked how he was doing, how work was going, if he was eating well, just the usual fatherly questions. He gave short, clipped answers. Then, after a brief pause, he said it. Dad, I don't have time for all these family obligations right now. I'm too busy. That was the sentence, delivered not with anger or malice, but with indifference. Cold, final. Family obligations. That's what I had become to him. An obligation, not a person, not a father, not someone whose sacrifices had helped build the very life he now lived. Just another chore on his to-do list. I didn't say anything for a long moment. I just let the words sink in like a stone in water. What do you say when someone you love deeply tells you, without hesitation, that your presence is no longer welcome? I told him I understood. I thanked him for calling back. And I ended the call with a simple, "Take care, son." My hand trembled as I put the phone down. My heart felt like it had been hollowed out. That night, I sat alone in the silence of my apartment, surrounded by the ghosts of every memory we'd shared. Photographs on the shelf, Father's Day card from years ago, a dusty box of Caleb's childhood drawings tucked under my bed. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I kept hearing his words on repeat, family obligations. Had I failed him somehow? Had I smothered him with my love, made him feel guilty for growing up and moving on? Or had he just forgotten the value of what we once shared? I wasn't sure, but I knew one thing for certain. Something was broken, and I didn't know how or if it could be fixed. I began withdrawing, not just from Caleb, but from everything. I stopped showing up to family gatherings because I couldn't bear the questions. Where's Caleb? How's your boy doing? I didn't have answers I wanted to say out loud. I let friendships fade, skipped my usual community events, and spent most of my time in that small apartment, moving through the days like a ghost. Every now and then, I'd scroll through old photos of us together, birthdays, fishing trips, goofy selfies from the back seat of the car, and wonder how those moments could turn into this emptiness. I started writing him letters I never sent, pages filled with things I wanted to say, but didn't know how. Apologies I wasn't sure I owed. Pain I didn't think he'd understand. What made it worse was that, on the surface, nothing looked broken. Caleb was thriving. New job, new apartment, a growing social circle. From a distance, he looked like he had everything together. And maybe he did. Maybe that's what hurt the most. That he was fine without me. That I was no longer needed. I used to believe a father's role was forever. That even when they no longer held your hand, they'd still want your guidance, your presence, your love. But Caleb made it clear he didn't, or at least not in the way I had always offered it. And yet, despite the hurt, I didn't blame him. Not entirely. I knew that this world moves fast, that it teaches people to prioritize success over connection, independence over interdependence. Maybe Caleb wasn't trying to be cruel. Maybe he didn't even realize how his words affected me. But that didn't lessen the sting. That didn't erase the ache of being left behind by someone you raised, someone you would have walked through fire for. That's the funny thing about love. It doesn't always fade with distance. Sometimes it deepens in silence. Sometimes it grows sharper when it's ignored. The conflict wasn't just between me and Caleb. It was within me. A war between the part of me that wanted to hold on and the part that knew I had to let go. Between the father who wanted to keep showing up, no matter what, and the man who needed to protect what little dignity he had left. I wasn't angry at Caleb. I wasn't bitter. I was just heartbroken. I had to make a choice. Either keep chasing a connection that clearly wasn't wanted, or step back and see what happened in the absence. Could love survive the distance? Would silence speak louder than words? I didn't know the answer yet, but I was about to find out. The days bled into weeks, and I began to realize that the silence wasn't just something I was enduring, it was something I was beginning to live with. At first, every morning felt like waking up with a weight on my chest. I'd reach for my phone instinctively, still expecting a message from Caleb, maybe a quick, "Hey, Dad," or even a forwarded meme like he used to send during college when he couldn't be bothered to talk but still wanted to stay connected. But every day, the screen was blank. No missed calls, no messages, just silence. And in that silence, my thoughts grew louder, crueler. I started questioning my worth, not just as a father, but as a person. If your own child no longer wanted you in their life, what did that say about the kind of man you were? I began to withdraw even further, not out of pride, but out of protection. Every small reminder of him became unbearable. The mug he gave me for Father's Day years ago, I pushed it to the back of the cabinet. The baseball glove we used during summer afternoons when he was 12, I boxed it away. I couldn't keep living inside a museum of memories that no longer had any meaning for him. I tried distracting myself. I picked up puzzles, read books I didn't care about, even considered getting a dog just to fill the silence. But nothing worked. Nothing dulled the ache of being discarded by someone who once clung to my hand and said I was his hero. And still, I didn't call. Not because I didn't want to. God knows I did. But I couldn't do it again. I couldn't be the only one trying. There's a strange kind of pain in being forgotten by someone you remember every single day. I had always told myself that fatherhood was about showing up, being consistent, loving without expecting anything in return. But what happens when you give and give until there's nothing left of you, and the other person still doesn't notice you're gone? One weekend, I went to the local park just to be around people, even if they were strangers. I watched fathers play with their children, young kids on swings, laughing, begging to be pushed higher. I saw men my age holding their grandchildren, beaming with pride. And I couldn't help but wonder if that could have been me. If in another life, I might have been there with Caleb and a child of his own, showing him how to tie tiny shoelaces, passing down the same stories my father told me. But instead, I was alone on a weathered bench, surrounded by echoes of a life I used to dream about. Eventually, word began to spread among family. Cousins asked me why Caleb hadn't been at Aunt Joanne's birthday party. My sister wondered aloud why he hadn't come around for Christmas. I dodged questions with vague answers. He's busy, work's been crazy, you know how it is. But the truth was, I didn't know anymore. I didn't know anything about his life, who he spent his time with, what he was passionate about, what kept him up at night. And he didn't know anything about mine. He didn't know I had developed chronic pain in my knees. He didn't know I'd lost my job for a short while and had to dip into my savings just to keep the lights on. He didn't know I'd started talking to myself just to hear a voice in the apartment. The silence between us had stopped being passive. It had become an active force, a wedge that grew larger by the day. But despite all that, I never spoke ill of him. Not once. Not to friends, not to family, not even in my own thoughts. I'd correct people when they made assumptions. He's a good kid, I'd say, even when I barely believed it anymore. Because I remember the boy he once was, the one who used to sit on my lap and ask me why the stars twinkled. The one who stayed up late watching cartoons with me when he couldn't sleep. That boy lived somewhere inside the man he had become, even if I couldn't see him anymore. I held on to that memory like a flame in a cold room. Still, the distance didn't just affect me. What made the pain more complicated, more twisted, was that I knew Caleb wasn't heartless. I'd raised him better than that. I could tell, maybe from his occasional likes on my social media posts, or a mutual friend mentioning he'd asked how I was, that he hadn't completely erased me. But he hadn't reached out either. And that told me everything I needed to know. I was on his mind, just not in his heart. I was a ghost he wasn't ready to confront. And maybe that made it worse than if he'd forgotten me entirely. It's one thing to be invisible. It's another to be remembered, but ignored. I sometimes imagined what he was telling himself. Maybe that I was fine, that I was strong, that I didn't need anyone, that I'd always be there like I always had been, waiting in the wings, ready to pick up the pieces if his life ever fell apart. But what he didn't realize was this: even fathers have breaking points. Even the strongest people crack under the weight of unreturned love. I'd always thought I was made of steel when it came to him. But this quiet exile he'd placed me in was turning me to rust. And then, just when I thought I'd finally numb myself to the pain, something happened that reawakened it all. A distant cousin sent me a photo from Caleb's recent birthday celebration. A beautiful dinner, cake, candles, smiling faces. Caleb was there, beaming in the center, surrounded by people I didn't recognize. Friends, co-workers, his new world. I studied that photo longer than I should have. Not because I wasn't happy for him. I truly was, but because I realized I wasn't even an afterthought in that moment. I wasn't invited. I wasn't mentioned. I wasn't missed. He had built a life where I no longer had a place, and for the first time, I wondered if he even wanted me back in it. After seeing that photo, Caleb surrounded by people, celebrating another year of his life without so much as a call or text to the man who raised him, something inside me finally shifted. Not in anger, not in rage, but in resignation. I stared at that image for what felt like hours, analyzing every corner, every face, looking for some hint that I still mattered. There was none. No empty seat at the table saved for me. No familiar face from our family circle that might have brought my name up during the toast. Just a celebration I had no part in for a person I no longer recognized. And in that moment, I realized something painful and profound. I was no longer part of my son's story. Not even the background character. Just edited out entirely. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, reliving every memory from his childhood. His first steps in the backyard, his scraped knees and tearful hugs, our movie nights when he insisted on watching the same cartoon 3 times in a row. I remembered how he clung to me the day his mom left, how I promised him we'd be okay, even when I wasn't sure we would. I remembered how I worked double shifts to afford his tuition, going without so he wouldn't have to. All of those memories, things I held on to so tightly, felt like ashes now. Not because they weren't real, but because they no longer seemed to matter. At least not to him. And yet, somehow, I couldn't hate him. I wanted to. I wanted to blame him for being cold, selfish, blind. But hate requires energy I no longer had. All I had left was the hollow ache of absence, the grief of someone still living. The worst part of being forgotten by someone you love is not the silence. It's the fact that the world keeps turning as if nothing happened. People go on with their lives, and you're left behind with questions no one's interested in answering. I began to question the nature of love itself. Was it truly unconditional? Or was that something we told ourselves to justify being mistreated, overlooked, left out? I didn't know anymore. I just knew that everything I believed about fatherhood, about family, about loyalty and presence, it was all being tested in a way I hadn't anticipated. And still I waited. A part of me, as bruised as it was, still held on to the faint hope that Caleb would wake up one day and remember who I was. Not just as a person, but as his father. That he'd feel the space I once filled and finally understand what he had let slip away. But as days stretched into more weeks, that hope grew fainter. I stopped going to the park. I stopped answering calls from distant relatives. I even stopped opening Caleb's social media. I couldn't keep looking into a window I wasn't invited to stand behind. I started talking less to others, but more to myself. Long, rambling conversations that echoed through the apartment like ghosts. Where did I go wrong? What could I have done differently? Was I too much? I tried journaling, but every page came out as a letter to him. Letters I'd never send because I didn't want to guilt him. That was never my intention. All I ever wanted was a little time. A conversation. A moment of shared air. And yet, in his eyes, even that was too much. The loneliness became a quiet routine. Wake up, coffee, a walk, maybe a book, dinner alone, fall asleep hoping tomorrow would feel less empty. But it never did. And then came another moment, small but gut-wrenching. I ran into an old friend at the grocery store, a man I hadn't seen in years. We chatted briefly, and he asked the inevitable, "So how's your son doing these days?" I froze. It was a simple question, one most parents would answer with pride. But I didn't know how to respond. How do you tell someone that your son is thriving, but you have no part in it? That he's alive and well, just absent from your life? I smiled politely and said, "He's doing well, I think." I don't think my voice fully hid the hurt. My friend nodded and moved on, but I stood there in the cereal aisle, feeling like I had just lied to cover up a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. I realized then that this wasn't just about being ignored. It was about losing a core part of my identity. For over 2 decades, I had been Caleb's dad. That title came before anything else, before Stephen, before Carpenter, before neighbor or friend. And now, without that connection, I felt untethered, like a ship without anchor or direction. The hardest part wasn't missing him. It was not knowing if he missed me, not knowing if I even existed in his private thoughts. not knowing if he ever stared at his phone the way I did, wondering if he should reach out, but deciding against it. I didn't want pity. I didn't want an apology. I just wanted to be remembered. I just wanted a sign that I mattered. And yet, none came. That's when it finally hit me. Maybe love isn't about always being there. Maybe sometimes love means stepping away, even if it breaks your heart. Maybe, just maybe, the only way for him to see what he had lost was for me to stop reminding him it existed in the first place. And so I stopped waiting. I didn't stop loving him. I don't think I ever could. But I stopped waiting for him to come around. I stopped checking my phone for messages that never came. I stopped hoping that every knock at the door might be him. Instead, I started learning how to live in the quiet. Not because I wanted to, but because I had to. It happened on an evening like any other. Quiet, unremarkable, soaked in the dull rhythm of solitude I had grown so used to. I had just finished a lukewarm dinner for one and was washing my single plate, listening to the soft hum of the faucet, when I heard it a knock. Just two soft, uncertain taps on the door. I froze. It had been so long since anyone came by unannounced that my first instinct was disbelief. Maybe it was a neighbor or someone selling something. But something in the rhythm of that knock, a hesitation, a familiarity, made my breath catch. Slowly, I dried my hands, walked to the door, and opened it. And there he was, Caleb, my son, standing in the dim hallway light, a little older, a little thinner, his face etched with something I hadn't seen in years, uncertainty. His hands were buried deep in his jacket pockets, his shoulders slightly hunched, his eyes flickering between the ground and my face, like he wasn't sure if he was welcome. I didn't speak. I couldn't. My throat tightened the moment I saw him, and for a heartbeat, all I could do was look at him. Really look. The last time I saw his face in person, he had been full of energy, hurried words, and dismissive tones. But now, there was a stillness to him, a fragility that startled me. "Hi, Dad," he said, almost a whisper, like he didn't know if he had the right to call me that anymore. I nodded, stepped aside, and let him in. The apartment suddenly felt too small for the weight of the moment. He walked slowly, like a stranger visiting a space he wasn't sure belonged to him. He sat on the edge of the couch, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. I sat across from him, unsure if I should speak first, unsure if I could. For a long moment, the silence stretched between us, not uncomfortable, but heavy, like both of us were sifting through years of things left unsaid. Finally, he looked up at me, and his voice cracked as he said, "I didn't realize how quiet life would get without you." I blinked. Of all the things he could have said, excuses, explanations, even anger, I hadn't expected honesty. Real, vulnerable honesty. He continued, "At first, I thought it was a relief. Not having to feel guilty about not calling, not visiting. I thought I needed the space. I told myself it was just a phase, that you'd always be there, and I could just come back when I was ready." He paused, breathing shakily, eyes glassy. "But then you stopped calling. You stopped showing up. And at first, I thought you were just giving me time. But when you missed my birthday, when you weren't there for Christmas," he trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. I could see it, the regret eating at him, raw and real. But still, I stayed quiet. I needed to hear everything. I started looking around and realized how empty things felt. I had friends, coworkers, a busy schedule, but something was missing. Something constant. Something grounding. And the more time passed, the more I felt it. That void. I'd see a father and son at the park and suddenly remember us throwing a baseball when I was 10. Or I'd smell wood polish and think of your workshop. It was like you were everywhere and nowhere at the same time. I swallowed hard, my chest heavy with emotion I wasn't sure how to express. Then he said something that hit deeper than anything else. "I thought you'd always be there, Dad. I guess I thought your love came without limits. And I was wrong. I took you for granted." That's when I spoke, not because I planned to, but because the words had been sitting in my chest for too long. "It's not that my love had limits, Caleb. It's that my heart did." I paused, letting the weight of that truth settle between us. I never stopped loving you, but I was tired of begging to be seen. I didn't want to force myself into your life. I needed to know that I mattered to you without having to chase after it. He looked at me then, really looked like a man seeing his father not as a fixture, not as an obligation, but as a human being. "You do matter," he said, more than I ever let on. I was just so focused on building my life that I forgot who helped build me. I didn't realize I was crying until I felt the warmth on my cheek. I wiped it away quickly, but I didn't try to hide it. We sat in that quiet moment, two flawed people learning how to find one another again. And in that moment, I realized something, too. Maybe distance wasn't a sign of failure. Maybe it was necessary. Maybe Caleb needed that silence to hear what I had been trying to say all along. That love isn't infinite when it's taken for granted. That presence isn't owed, it's earned. And maybe, just maybe, my absence had taught him what my presence never could. He asked me if we could start fresh, go slow, spend time, talk more. I didn't say yes right away. Not because I was angry, but because I needed him to understand that reconciliation wasn't about pretending the hurt never happened. It was about acknowledging it, learning from it, and choosing to do better. Eventually, I said, "We can start again," but I needed to be real this time. He nodded, and for the first time in years, he hugged me. Not a quick, awkward pat, but a long, heartfelt embrace. The kind you give someone you're afraid to lose again. And in that embrace, I felt the beginning of something new. Not a return to the past, but the birth of a new relationship built not just on love, but on understanding. The days following that unexpected reunion were quiet. Not the heavy, aching silence I had grown used to, but a softer one, filled with uncertainty and cautious hope. Caleb and I had cracked open the door that had been shut for far too long, but neither of us quite knew how to step through it. He started texting every few days. Small things like, "Hope your day's going well, Dad," or "Saw someone wearing your favorite baseball cap today." Each message was like a breadcrumb leading back to something we'd lost. And while I appreciated every word, part of me remained guarded. When you've been hurt deeply, not by enemies, but by the people you die for, it changes you. It teaches you not to trust so quickly. It teaches you that love, while beautiful, can also bleed. So even as my heart wanted to rush back into his life with open arms, my mind kept a cautious hand on the brakes. We agreed to meet once a week, nothing too formal. Just coffee on Sunday mornings at a small cafe near my apartment. At first, it felt awkward. Caleb didn't know how to ask questions that mattered, and I didn't know how to answer without sounding bitter. We danced around the past like it was broken glass we were both trying not to step on. But slowly, over weeks, something began to thaw. He started asking real questions about my health, my work, my memories from when he was a child. And I began answering with something I hadn't allowed myself in a long time: honesty. No sugarcoating. No pretending everything had been fine. I told him what those quiet months had done to me. The nights I sat staring at a door I hoped he'd walk through. The times I convinced myself I was okay just to get through the day. And I told him how, through it all, I never stopped loving him. But that love had begun to feel one-sided, like a story where only one person kept turning the pages. To his credit, Caleb didn't run from the truth. He didn't shrink back or deflect. He sat with it, let it sting, and listened. Sometimes his eyes welled up. Other times he just looked down at his coffee like it held the answers. He never once told me I was wrong to feel the way I did, and that, more than anything, began to rebuild my trust. Not because he was trying to fix it all at once, but because he was finally showing up, fully, painfully, and with a humility I never thought I'd see in him. Still, I knew this couldn't be the end of the story. Not just a quiet return to routine after so much had been broken. I needed something more, not dramatic, not performative, but real. A moment that would either prove this new beginning was genuine or confirm that he was only here out of guilt. And so, one day, I asked him to do something uncomfortable. I asked him to come with me to the cemetery to visit my father's grave. His grandfather, the man whose silent strength had shaped the father I tried to become. Caleb hadn't been there since the funeral nearly a decade ago. I wanted to see if he would say yes. If he understood that healing meant confronting not just our present, but our past. He hesitated, but only for a moment. Then he nodded, and we set a date. That Sunday, we drove in near silence. The only sound the soft hum of the engine and the occasional directions from my phone's GPS. When we arrived, the sky was overcast, the air cool, the grass wet with morning dew. I led him to the headstone, simple, unadorned, just like the man beneath it. We stood there for a while, neither of us speaking. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on both of us. After a few minutes, I spoke. He taught me everything I know about being strong, about showing up even when no one notices, about how love isn't about words, it's about consistency. And I try to pass that on to you. Caleb's voice was low, steady, but full of emotion. You did, Dad. I didn't understand what it meant until you weren't there anymore. I thought love would always wait for me. I didn't realize it could hurt this much when it's gone. I looked at him, really looked, and I could see it, the remorse, the growth, the hunger to rebuild what he'd let fall apart. That was when I realized the climax of this story wasn't about him coming back. It was about me choosing whether or not to let him, whether or not I could put aside the pain long enough to embrace the chance to begin again, whether I could be strong enough, not to protect myself, but to risk getting hurt again in the name of love. As we stood by my father's grave, side by side in the muted silence, I realized that this moment wasn't about death at all. It was about legacy, the kind that isn't carved into stone, but into the hearts of the people we love. My father had never been the expressive type, but he had shown up for me in the ways he knew how. Fixing things with his hands, staying quiet when I needed space, being a constant presence, even when life got messy. I had tried to do the same for Caleb, shaping my own version of fatherhood from a blueprint built on quiet devotion. And now, I was standing here with my son, staring at the grave of the man who started it all, and asking myself the hardest question I'd ever had to face. Could I let go of the pain long enough to start again? I turned to Caleb. He looked different in the soft gray light. Older, somehow, not just in age but in soul. His jaw was tense, his eyes glistening but dry. I could feel the words he wanted to say, but couldn't find. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't need them. Maybe that's what changes after enough hurt. You stop needing grand gestures and start looking for sincerity in the stillness. You know, I said, my voice low, there was a time I thought I'd always be your anchor. That no matter how far you drifted, you'd come back, and I'd still be standing in the same place waiting. I paused, letting the wind carry the silence for a moment. But I'm not that man anymore. I can't be, because standing still for someone who's already walked away, that nearly broke me. Caleb turned to me, his face pale with the weight of everything left unsaid. I don't want you to be that man again, he said. I want to meet you where you are now. I want to earn my way back into your life. Not because you're my dad, and not because I think you owe me another chance, but because I finally understand what it means to love someone and not show it, and I don't want to live with that kind of regret. And there it was. Not an apology wrapped in guilt. Not a plea for things to go back to the way they were. But something more honest, acknowledgement. Growth. A desire not just to be forgiven, but to do better. I had spent so many nights imagining what I would say if Caleb ever came back, rehearsing speeches in my mind, practicing lines that ranged from cold indifference to righteous fury. But none of those scripts fit in that moment. Because the truth was, I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to make him suffer the way I had. I just wanted to feel like I mattered to him again. Like my love hadn't been wasted. And in his eyes, in his voice, in the way he was finally standing still with me instead of running, I saw that maybe, just maybe, I still did. I took a deep breath, the kind that feels like it scrapes against your ribs on the way out. If we're going to do this, I said, it has to be different this time. No more avoiding hard conversations. No more disappearing acts. I don't want surface-level texts and quick coffee chats. If you want me in your life, I want all in. Otherwise, I'd rather remember you the way you were before the silence. His eyes didn't waver. All in, he said. Whatever it takes. And I believed him. We stood there a little while longer, not saying much, just letting the stillness settle around us. It didn't feel like a reunion. It felt like a reckoning, like the past had finally been acknowledged, grieved, and released. When we walked back to the car, Caleb opened the door for me without saying a word. It was a small gesture, but it said more than he realized. Respect, awareness, presence. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. On the drive back, we talked. Really talked. about everything we'd both been afraid to say for so long. His fear of not living up to my example, my fear of becoming invisible, the way guilt had kept him away, and how silence had nearly become permanent. We didn't cry. We didn't shout. We just laid it all out there, raw and real. And as the miles passed, something shifted between us. Not a complete repair, but the fragile, beautiful beginning of something new. When he dropped me off, he didn't rush away. He came inside, helped me tidy up the kitchen, and we shared a simple dinner. Nothing fancy, just pasta and toast. But for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the apartment didn't feel empty. The silence wasn't hollow. And as he left that night, he turned and said, "I'll call you tomorrow." I nodded. "I'll answer." And in that simple exchange, we rewrote the ending we were never supposed to have. Life didn't suddenly become perfect after that night. It didn't click back into place like a puzzle where all the pieces had been found. Instead, it slowly started to take shape again, one gentle step at a time, like the rebuilding of a home after a long winter. Caleb kept his word. He called the next day and the day after that. Some calls were short, some stretched late into the night. At first, our conversations tiptoed around the pain, but eventually they began to carry weight again, honest, vulnerable, unfiltered. We talked not just as father and son, but as two men who had hurt and been hurt, who had misunderstood and misstepped, but who were willing to meet each other in the middle without pride or pretense. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't talking to a stranger. I was talking to my son, not the boy I raised, but the man he had become, a man trying, in his own quiet way, to stitch together what he'd once torn apart. We started seeing each other more often. He helped me with errands, sometimes just showed up unannounced with takeout and a movie in hand. The first time he said, "I missed you," without avoiding eye contact, I didn't know how to respond. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was simple, almost shy. But in that moment, it carried more weight than 1,000 apologies. And slowly, I started to let go of the walls I had built around my heart. I stopped counting how many days it had been since I last felt close to him, stopped replaying the hurt like a loop in my mind. Because something had changed, not just in him, but in me. I had spent so long defining myself by the love I gave, by the presence I maintained, by the sacrifices I made, that I never realized how much of myself I had lost in the process. When Caleb walked away, I didn't just lose a son. I lost my sense of purpose. But now, as we stood shoulder to shoulder again, not out of obligation but out of choice, I began to rediscover that my value wasn't tied to what I could give, but simply to who I was. Not a perfect man, not an infallible father, but a human being worthy of love, respect, and peace. One evening, as we sat on the same creaky porch swing that once held a boy in his dreams, Caleb asked me something that surprised me. He said, "Did you ever think about giving up on me?" I paused, took a long breath, and said, "Yes, but only because I thought you'd already given up on me." He looked down, nodded slowly, and whispered, "I didn't. I just didn't know how to come back." And in that moment, it all made sense. It wasn't just pride or distance or distraction that had kept him away. It was fear. The fear that maybe too much damage had been done, that too much silence had passed. The fear that he'd burned the bridge and there would be no way back. But there was. There always had been. It just took one honest step, one knock on the door to prove that. I don't know what the future holds for us. I'm not naive enough to believe everything will be perfect from here on out. We're still learning how to trust again, how to talk without hiding, how to love without fearing loss. But what I do know is this: we are trying. And sometimes trying is enough. Sometimes trying is everything. If you had told me a year ago that I'd be sitting across from my son again, laughing over stories we both thought we'd forgotten, I wouldn't have believed you. I would have told you that some wounds don't heal, that some doors stay closed. But now I know better. I know that people can change, not just once, but continually. I know that relationships can be reborn, not as copies of what they were, but as something entirely new, stronger, more honest, more grounded. And I know that even when love feels lost, it's never truly gone. It waits, sometimes in silence, sometimes in pain, but it waits for the right moment, the right choice, the right heart to finally come home. And if there's anything I hope you take from my story, it's this. Never assume that love is owed, and never assume that time heals all wounds. What heals is effort. What mends is humility. And what restores is the courage to say, I was wrong, and the grace to reply, I'm still here. If you're someone who's felt forgotten, discarded, or left behind by the very people you gave your heart to, know this. You are not alone. And your worth is not diminished by their inability to see it. You can still stand tall, even in silence. You can still find peace, even in distance. And if the door ever opens again, if they ever come back, you get to choose how the next chapter is written. For me, I chose love. Not the blind kind. Not the kind that gives without boundaries. But the kind that forgives, that learns, that says, I won't forget what happened, but I won't let it define us. My story didn't end in heartbreak. It ended in a quiet, imperfect, beautiful reconciliation that reminded me what love is really about. Not perfection, not permanence, but presence. And sometimes presence is everything. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you of someone you've lost touch with, someone you once held close but drifted away from, take a moment and reflect. We often wait for the right time to reach out, not realizing that time isn't promised, and silence can become a permanent goodbye if we let it. Maybe you've been the one left behind, or maybe you were the one who walked away. Either way, there's always a chance, however small, to rewrite the ending. If you've ever felt the ache of being taken for granted or the guilt of taking someone for granted yourself, know that you're not alone. Love is messy, imperfect, and sometimes painful, but it's also resilient. It can survive silence. It can endure distance, and it can begin again. So I ask you, what would you do if someone you love stopped showing up? Would you wait? Would you let them go? Or would you take the first step toward healing? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Your stories matter, and they might just help someone else who's going through something similar. If you found this story meaningful, please consider subscribing for more powerful, real-life stories that dive deep into the heart of what it means to be human. Every like, every comment, every share helps keep these stories alive and gives them the power to reach someone who needs them. Thank you for watching. And remember, sometimes the smallest step, the quietest word, or the simplest act of forgiveness can be the beginning of everything. Don't wait for the perfect moment. Make the moment matter. Let this story be a reminder that it's never too late to reach out, to reconnect, or to begin again.